I've been a fan of Mortal Kombat for as long as I can remember. MK3 was my first proper video game that I really took a liking to, and I've pretty much absorbed everything about this franchise for a lifetime. I commentate competitive Mortal Kombat these days, but I used to play competitively, attend tournaments to compete in, and all that good stuff. The thing is, I'm also huge on arcade culture. I make the MK Meta YouTube series because I want to keep competitive Mortal Kombat's history alive, on top of always getting hands-on with MK at any arcade I can get to. Arcade Mortal Kombat is actually my favourite age of the entire franchise. The reason I've opened the video with this is simple. It's very difficult for me to play anything that's not an official release. Mortal Kombat has tons of fan-made ROM hacks and community balance patches for games like MK2, UMK3, or MK9. They're all excellent and well made, but I usually don't play them because I just prefer the original and authentic experience if I'm going to play one of those games. A side of Mortal Kombat that has always existed, and I've always known about, is the Mugen games. Fan-made creations in their entirety, often combining mechanics, adding new mechanics, new characters. It's fan-made in every capacity. I've never looked at these games besides the occasional YouTube video, but I get requests to play these all the time. But there's just so many of them with so many additions that I never really knew where to start. On top of the fact that I just wasn't sure if I was interested because their fan-made creations and mechanics and authenticity are a really big deal for me. I decided to change that and reach out to my community on social media. People sent me their favourite versions and favourite Mugen games. I've gathered what appeared to be some of the most popular ones that have been released. This video is simple. I consider myself quite the purist with Mortal Kombat, and I finally jump into the world of Mortal Kombat Mugen, giving an honest opinion of my experiences and first impressions. I do apologise in advance if any of the versions that I'm playing are out of date or something. By all means, let me know in the comments section. I've gone into this completely cold, so I have no prior knowledge of any of these games. It is one of the reasons that I thought it would be interesting to make this video. Before I start anything, I think I need to answer the question of what is Mugen. Simply put, it's a freeware 2D fighting game engine. It was originally released right at the end of the 90s and is a means for anybody to create their own fighting game in a rather simple manner. The core game engine is there, and everything else can be quite simply added as far as programming goes. It's always often been said that Mugen is a really good entry-level dive into programming and fighting games in general. Never touched it myself, but in my time with fighting games, I've definitely had conversations with people that have used it and have enjoyed the experience. The point is, Mugen is a means to make a fighting game with your own content inside of it, and pretty much everything is user-generated. Now, I need to say that this video focuses on strictly Mugen-style games. I won't be covering popular ROM hacks like UMK3 Plus and UMK3 Ultimate Cup. They're modified versions of the arcade game itself, and they use the arcade machine to run, whether it's a real board or emulation. Now we've got that out of the way, let's actually take a look at the first game on my list, which I think is quite the introduction if you've never seen a Mugen game before. This is Mortal Kombat Chaotic. Okay, so I had absolutely no intention of actually doing any sort of live audio for this, but this is the first time I've ever loaded this up. I've known you've got quite a lot of characters, but like Homer Simpson, Ronald McDonald, The Undertaker, Kane, Doink the Clown. I knew this game was like bizarre, but not to this caliber, I will be honest. You start with an innocent-looking menu and some 3D-era MK music, just like Armageddon, I suppose, and then you select a mode. Almost immediately it's, oh my days, what is all this? MK Chaotic has supposedly over 200 characters. I'm not counting them all, but just look for yourself. The first mistake I made with Mugen MK is that I went into it expecting it to feel like classic Mortal Kombat. In some ways, I'm there, and in some ways, I'm definitely not. Almost all of these games are based on Mortal Kombat 3, so that's dial-in combos and a run button. Chaotic is absolutely the same as that, so if we're talking about being able to run in and do combos, that's all still there. For this game, there's really no point going into the mechanics though, because the biggest thing that stood out to me is the absolute gigantic roster, and that's definitely both a good and bad thing. The reality is, you get both sides of this. Some characters that feel really polished as far as fan games go, and then you get other characters which definitely don't feel as much. I'm definitely not going to make any bold claims here, but it does very much feel like the game is almost a general container for all of these fan-made characters. Kind of feels like they've all been put into the game from other Mugen titles, and this is like some sort of giant gathering of sorts. Some characters have a move list, some don't, some have bios, some don't. This game to me definitely seems like a good one to play if you want the absolute insanity and ridiculousness of a Mugen MK. If we're talking characters alone, I think you pretty much get the complete package here, although it's still weird seeing Fulgor from Killer Instinct fight Guile from the Street Fighter movie game. It's barely even Mortal Kombat now, isn't it? They're stuck inside each other. I had a fun time going over some of the more ridiculous characters and stuff like that, but it didn't quite hold my attention like the next game that I'm going to cover. The next game is the one that by far had the most recommendations by the community and even seems to be one of, if not the most famous versions. This is Mortal Kombat Project Revitalized 2 Definitive Edition. I definitely have the most to say about this game in particular because, I'm going to be honest, it really caught me off guard. It always seemed to me like Mugen games have pretty inconsistent rates of polish. Some parts of a game will be a lot more refined than others, but with this game in particular, polish seems to be almost everywhere, and honestly, it's not really like any of the other classic games either. It feels like its own thing entirely, and once I realized that, I started having a lot more fun. My first test was to use Sector, as he's my favourite character. This might have been a bad idea in hindsight, because although he has slightly new visuals in an updated helmet, presumably to make him more like his modern look, he's still exactly the same character, besides the inclusion of his Armageddon pulse blades either on their own or in a new string that he's been given. This isn't a bad thing, because I would want these characters to feel familiar if they're based on classic games, but it did just make him feel a bit off, I guess. I think it's the different animations that he has. It makes some of his combos and setups feel a bit different, and it was enough for me to not really want to use him much here. That said, once I'd gone off from Sector and tried other characters I really liked, the fun really started to begin. I started playing Rain, who, I've got to say, had an impressive amount of work done to merge some of his modern moves into his old moveset. This version of the character is unlike any form of Rain that I've played before, and it was really cool. He has a launcher, his Armageddon teleport, his jet stream from MK9, put them all together and he's got some really sweet combos. Playing Rain in this game was the point I realized that it's absolutely its own experience, and it's not really fair for me to compare this kind of game to the arcade classics, because it doesn't feel like the game is trying to be those things. Let's take a look at some other examples on that note. Some modern characters have been reimagined in the classic style. Triborg, for example, was a robot version of Chameleon, basically, where he changes between Smoke, Sector, and Cyrax with all of their old moves intact. But there's also a classic-style Cyber Sub-Zero in this game that Triborg also becomes, because remember, he has that fourth variation in Mortal Kombat X. It's really neat. Triborg Sector, by the way, keeps the old sprite set, so he feels a lot more familiar. On the subject of Chameleon, he's actually my second favourite Mortal Kombat character of all time, so you know I gave him a go. Again, a really neat in-game concept. He changes between the ninjas, just like in Trilogy, but his visuals are slightly different with every ninja swap. He isn't that different, but I do like his visuals. A classic experience in a new style of game. Just as fun as I remember. With all this does come the characters who have never been in a 2D arcade game, and there's quite a few of them as you'd expect. The one I had the most fun with was actually Quan Chi. He's got tons of extra moves, like hazards and setups for guaranteed hits, and the fact that his straight skulls have enough hits done to combo. Combine this with the trance, and he's actually one of the most enjoyable characters that I've used in this entire Mugen experience. If we're talking mechanics, this game has the max damage mechanic from MK4, although the damage threshold is a bit higher here, and breakers from the more modern games. I believe the older versions of this had 3 breakers each, like the 3D days, but this version has a more up-to-date version of a meter. These are the two things that give an extra edge to the whole game and make it very much not play like classic arcade. You have other modes which can get really wild. 2v2 is not 2v2 as we remember, because both characters are actually on the screen at the same time, which is definitely an experience. It was pretty fun just cheesing out the AI with tremor ground pounds and projectiles, even in the highest difficulties. But I didn't play this much. Same for the turns category. You take it in turns per round to play with 2 different characters. Interesting, but not for me. There's an absolute ton of stages too, many stages being taken from modern games, the games in between. It's a complete gathering of different settings across years and years of Mortal Kombat. Some stages do have weird lighting though, and it's difficult to see the action, which is a bummer. I'd have preferred consistent lighting so I can always see the action properly. Mortal Kombat Project was a good time to learn and mess around with. It took warming up to it, I will admit, but as a complete package, I was really impressed. Of all the games that I'm covering today, this one was definitely the one that kept my attention for the longest time. The final game here is Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Earth. It appears that it's once again based on some previous projects, but it goes in a different direction. The first thing that hits you is the visuals. You can tell from the get-go that it's very much more of an artistic version of the game, and it looks really tidy. You can tell that a lot of effort went into how it looks. It follows a Mortal Kombat X style of visuals where everything like text and UI is very tidy, and it does match the visual themes of the game. Characters are once again like MK Project, although some characters do have changes or new moves. It's quite hard to find out which characters came from where, I've come to realize. However, I'm not sure if I've been playing it wrong or doing the wrong combos and stuff, but I have to say, mechanically, it's probably the game that I personally enjoyed the least, and let me tell you why. Classic Mortal Kombat is very up close and personal, and the characters take up a lot of that screen space, normally. The entire game is generally built upon that, because the games are fast, aggressive, combo heavy. With Defenders of the Earth, the characters are tiny in comparison, and the stages are ginormous. From a visual side, they look spectacular, and again, I really don't want to undermine the efforts that were clearly taken here. But on a mechanical level, the stages are just way too big for me to really do much with certain characters. Characters who rely on side switch to really thrive, like Scorpion or Smoke teleports, Rain's roundhouse. A lot of these combos that you would do don't work because there's just no way you can cover all that distance in one go. It was a bit of a shame because visually the game looks great. I'm just not a massive fan of the gameplay because of this. It makes a huge difference to me. By all means, if I just had the wrong idea or something, please let me know. There's always the chance I was trying to play it like a game that it wasn't made to be, which I would totally understand. One of the good things that came from the larger screen is that the other more chaotic modes have room to actually be played properly in this game. 2v2 doesn't feel like a complete blender, so you've actually got some space to do things, and dare I say, maybe even be a bit more strategic. If I played this game more, I think I'd do 2v2 more often for this reason. The visuals really are awesome, especially the modern stages being turned into 2D. I'd prefer to play game modes that make more sense for this kind of design. I may not be a massive fan of the screen size in a 1v1 space, but perhaps 2v2 is a better suited experience, you know? Oh yeah, and there didn't seem to be much corner pushback, so you could get some interesting combo enders, that's for sure. So, what's my final verdict here? I've been playing these games for a few days now to really try and get the feel for them. I went into this as an arcade purist who almost never tries anything MK related unless it's an official release, and the reason is simply because of mechanics. The visuals and the style of Mortal Kombat is great, and so are the characters, but it's always been the gameplay that I've loved. And that gameplay is so specific to Mortal Kombat that I've just never really believed that other games based on it can ever match that gameplay in general. You'll notice that's why I've not covered finishing moves or anything. They look cool, but that's not why I've played these games. My final verdict is that I think I made a mistake playing the games, expecting them to feel like classic arcade-era Mortal Kombat. By doing that, I set myself up for a different experience to the one that I actually got. You can see the run button and the combo strings and assume that's all you need, but so many of these games had added mechanics like Aggressor from Trilogy, combo breakers, max damage. They're clearly not meant to be compared, in my opinion anyway. The first game I tried was MK Project, and the first character I played was Sector. He felt weird, although familiar. He was still Sector with some added moves, but some of his attacks felt and looked different, but because his core gameplay was the same, it just didn't feel right, and I felt my initial fears of trying this kind of game might have been true. Then, I played Rain, and noticed almost instantly that it's different. Treat it as its own thing, with its own take on characters. Play those new additions or reworked members of the cast and you'll find yourself having a bit more fun, I think. It certainly was fun for me. If you expect classic MK, it's not gonna feel right. But if you see it as a fan project made by passionate people with their own spin on things, you'll have a lot more fun. If I were to order the games mechanically, I guess it would be something like this. My least favourite, but definitely not disliked, was Defenders of the Earth. A visually impressive experience, and I really appreciate the work that went into it, but due to the screen size, I just didn't find myself having as much fun as the other games. Like I said before, I think I'd play this game more as a 2v2 experience because 1v1 had way too much empty space for my liking. Second was chaotic. I still don't really know how I feel about it. It's just ridiculous playing all these different characters with somewhat familiar mechanics, and it is a pretty funny experience all round. But I definitely found myself playing it for shorter times because of the up and down levels of quality. It could get a bit tiring. But if we're talking gameplay, it played like a somewhat crazier version of MK Project, so I guess it was number 2. And by far my favourite one was MK Project. It was a really enjoyable experience just learning combos and messing with training mode. It's presented well and it has some cool ideas for characters. It feels polished and it runs well. I dislike the max damage because I personally don't like that mechanic in general, but who knows what kind of crazy infinites or combos might have existed without it, so maybe that's a good thing. Overall, this was the highest quality, and it still felt familiar on a basic level, although it still didn't feel like the classics mechanically. Great job all round though. Well, I hope you enjoyed this dive into the Mugen world with me in somewhat of a different direction for a video. I've been making a lot of in-depth stuff recently, so taking that eye into the fan creation world has been quite fun. You can tell that a lot of passion has gone into this stuff, and I really dig that with these kind of games. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, or even joining my Patreon to help me create more content still. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.